The day my grandfather's estate was divided, everyone walked out of the attorney's office smiling. Everyone except me. My older brother, Daniel, stopped beside me just long enough to pat my shoulder. Looks like Grandpa knew exactly who deserved what. He laughed as he walked away. Natalie followed him, already talking about renovations she wanted to make to the lake cabin she'd inherited. Even my father looked satisfied. No one noticed that I hadn't said a single word. For months later, my phone rang just after 10 o'clock on a Tuesday night. The contractor restoring Grandpa's old farmhouse sounded nothing like his usual calm self. "Emily, you need to get out here." "What happened?" There was a long pause. "We found something hidden behind a basement wall." By the time I reached the property, sheriff's deputies had already finished their initial walkthrough. Construction workers stood quietly near the porch, speaking in low voices. No one seemed willing to be the first to explain what they'd found. Downstairs, part of the old stone foundation had been opened during the renovation. Behind it was a narrow hidden chamber. Inside sat a heavy iron chest covered in decades of dust. 2 letters had been carved into the lid. EC. My initials. The chest didn't contain gold. It didn't contain stacks of cash. What it held was far more dangerous. It held the truth. A truth someone had worked very hard to keep buried. But before I tell you what was inside that chest, let me introduce myself. And thank you for spending a little time with me today. If you enjoy stories about family secrets, betrayal, and the unexpected ways justice sometimes finds its way home, I'd love to know where you're listening from. My name is Emily Carter. I'm 31 years old. Until recently, I believed I came from an ordinary family. Successful, respectable, the kind of family everyone else admired. Looking back now, I realize we weren't hiding cracks. We were hiding an entire collapse. To understand why that iron chest changed everything, you need to know what my family was like before Grandpa died. Every Sunday evening, dinner at my parents' house was less of an invitation than a rule. 6 o'clock. Same dining room. Same seats. Same conversations. Dad always sat at the head of the table. Mom sat beside him. Daniel and his wife usually arrived first. Natalie wasn't far behind. I always seemed to end up closest to the kitchen. Nobody assigned the seats. It just happened that way. Funny how families create traditions without ever talking about them. My parents lived in a beautiful colonial home in Westchester County. Fresh flowers by the front door. A perfectly trimmed lawn. Family photographs lined the hallway. To anyone visiting for the first time, we probably looked like the picture of success. Appearances can be remarkably convincing. That particular Sunday, everyone was celebrating Daniel's promotion to vice president at his investment firm. Dad raised his glass. "I always knew you'd go far." Mom beamed. "We're so proud of you." Everyone joined the toast. I waited for the conversation to settle before mentioning something that had happened at work. The literacy program just graduated 23 adults this week. I thought Grandpa would have liked hearing that. I worked for a nonprofit that helped adults earn high school diplomas later in life. The paycheck wasn't impressive. The work was. Mom smiled politely. "That's wonderful, sweetheart." Before I could say anything else, she turned back to Daniel. "So, tell us more about that new office." The conversation moved on without me. No one interrupted. No one noticed. It had happened so many times over the years that silence had become my place at the table. After dinner, everyone drifted into the living room. Dad and Daniel started talking investments. Natalie scrolled through vacation photos on her phone. Mom cleared a few plates before I quietly took over washing the dishes. She didn't ask me to. I didn't volunteer. It was simply what always happened. Only one person ever seemed to notice. Grandpa. Before leaving each Sunday, he'd squeeze my shoulder as he walked past. Never long enough for anyone else to notice. Just long enough for me to hear him say, "Don't confuse quiet with weakness." Every single week. The words never changed. Neither did the look in his eyes. At the time, I thought he was simply encouraging me. Now I know he was trying to prepare me. 3 days later, Grandpa called. "Emily," he said, "I baked an apple pie." I laughed. "You baked?" "I supervised," he corrected. "The oven deserves most of the credit." That sounded more like him. "I've got enough pie here to feed half the county. You'd better come rescue me before I have to eat it all myself. I'll come by tomorrow after work. I'll save you the biggest slice." Those were the last words my grandfather ever said to me. For days later, just after sunrise, my phone rang again. This time, it wasn't Grandpa. Grandpa passed away 4 days later. The call came just after sunrise. For a long moment, I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at my phone, hoping I'd misunderstood what I'd just heard. Outside my apartment window, the neighborhood carried on as if nothing had happened. Cars rolled past. A dog barked somewhere down the street. Someone was already mowing their lawn. The world hadn't changed. Mine had. The funeral was held the following week. More people showed up than I ever expected. Former employees, neighbors, business owners, teachers, families I'd never met before. Nearly everyone had a story about Grandpa. One man told me Grandpa had quietly paid his daughter's college tuition after a fire destroyed their home. A young couple said he'd rebuilt their front porch after a storm and refused to accept a single dollar. An elderly woman hugged me tightly. "Your grandfather never wanted anyone to know when he helped people," she whispered. "That's why so few people realize how much he did." I smiled through tears. That sounded exactly like him. Dad delivered the eulogy. He spoke confidently about family, hard work, and the importance of leaving something behind for the next generation. Most people nodded along. Some wiped away tears. Standing in the second row, I couldn't help wondering whether Grandpa would have recognized the version of himself being described. Over the last few years, he and Dad had quietly drifted apart. They rarely argued in public. They didn't need to. The silence between them said enough. I'd seen it during Sunday dinners. Conversations that stopped the moment one of them entered the room. Quick changes of subject. Polite smiles that never quite reached their eyes. I never knew exactly why. At the time, I assumed it was simply the stubbornness that sometimes comes with age. Looking back, I think it was something much deeper. After the service, people gathered outside the church. Daniel was already talking with Dad about estate taxes. Natalie joked about finally finding space for Grandpa's antique furniture. No one sounded cruel. Just practical. Grief has a strange way of sharing space with ordinary life. As everyone began leaving, an older woman approached me. Her name was Evelyn Harper. She had lived next door to Grandpa for nearly 40 years. She squeezed my hand gently. "Your grandfather worried about you." I frowned. "Worried?" She nodded. "He always said you carried too much by yourself." Before I could ask what she meant, Dad called everyone toward the parking lot. The conversation ended as quickly as it had begun. 3 weeks later, we gathered in the office of Harold Mason, the attorney handling Grandpa's estate. The atmosphere couldn't have been more different from the funeral. Coffee cups sat on the conference table. Legal pads were neatly arranged in front of every chair. No one said it out loud, but everyone had come expecting answers. Mr. Mason adjusted his glasses and began reading the will. Daniel inherited Grandpa's investment portfolio. Natalie received the lake cabin in Vermont along with his classic car collection. Dad was appointed trustee over several remaining business interests until the estate could be fully settled. Each announcement was followed by quiet smiles and grateful nods. Then Mr. Mason turned the final page. "And to my granddaughter, Emily Carter." He paused just long enough for everyone to look in my direction. "I leave my property located on Willow Creek Road, together with the residence, surrounding acreage, all permanent structures, and everything remaining on the premises." Silence settled over the room. Daniel broke it first. "The farmhouse." He actually laughed. "I thought Grandpa would have sold that place years ago." Natalie shook her head. "Emily always did like old houses." Dad leaned back in his chair. "The taxes alone will keep you busy." No one sounded angry. If anything, they sounded relieved. As though I'd unknowingly accepted a problem they were happy to avoid. I waited for Mr. Mason to continue reading. He closed the folder instead. That was it. No investment account. No trust fund. No cash inheritance. Just the old farmhouse. Outside the office, Daniel caught up with me before I reached my car. "Think about selling it." He slipped a business card into my hand. "I know a developer who's been asking about that property for years." "I appreciate it," I said, "but I haven't even seen the place yet." He shrugged. "Once you do, you'll understand." Dad joined us a moment later. "Your brother's giving you good advice. That house has been empty for years. It'll cost more to fix than it's worth." Maybe he believed that. Maybe he wanted me to. Either way, I wasn't ready to make a decision. The following Saturday, I drove north alone. The gravel driveway was nearly hidden beneath tall grass. The farmhouse looked tired. Paint peeled from the siding. Several porch railings had collapsed. One corner of the old barn leaned just enough to make me nervous. Most people would have seen an abandoned property. I saw summers spent chasing fireflies, fishing with Grandpa in the creek behind the house. Apple pie cooling on the kitchen windowsill. Stories told on the front porch until the sun disappeared behind the trees. The front door creaked as I pushed it open. Dust drifted through the afternoon light. The house smelled faintly of old pine boards and wood smoke. Everything was quiet, not abandoned. Waiting. Grandpa's workbench still stood in the corner of the workshop. His favorite coffee mug sat beside the sink. Even the old battery-powered radio rested exactly where he'd always kept it. It felt less like a forgotten house, and more like someone had stepped outside for a moment. Before leaving that afternoon, I walked onto the back porch and looked across the fields. A breeze moved gently through the tall grass. I could almost hear Grandpa's voice. Some things are worth more than money, Emily. At the time, I thought he was talking about family. Months later, I realized he had been talking about something else entirely. For the next several weeks, I spent almost every Saturday at the farmhouse. At first, I told myself I was only cleaning, one room at a time, one dusty shelf after another. But somewhere between scrubbing old hardwood floors and sorting through Grandpa's workshop, the place stopped feeling like an inheritance. It started feeling like home. Every corner carried a memory. His flannel jacket still hung behind the back door. A pair of worn work gloves rested on the bench in the workshop. Inside the kitchen pantry, I found an old tin filled with handwritten recipe cards in Grandma's neat cursive. Nothing had been staged. Nothing had been preserved like a museum. The house simply looked as though life had paused. Every now and then I'd catch myself smiling at something unexpected. An old measuring stick Grandpa used to mark my height every birthday. A chipped coffee mug with a crack running down one side. The tiny wooden birdhouse we'd built together when I was 9. Little things. The kind no one else would have considered valuable. One afternoon, while cleaning the attic, I found a cardboard box filled with photographs. Most showed ordinary moments. Family cookouts, fishing trips, Christmas mornings. Grandpa never seemed interested in posing for the camera. He was usually the one laughing in the background, or helping someone else. There wasn't a single photograph of expensive vacations or fancy dinners. Looking through those pictures, I realized something. The wealth everyone admired about Grandpa had never really been his money. It was the life he'd built around it. By early spring, however, reality caught up with nostalgia. The farmhouse needed far more than fresh paint and elbow grease. Several floor joists had begun to sag. The plumbing leaked in 2 places. Part of the electrical system no longer met code. Even the foundation needed repairs in one corner of the basement. This wasn't a weekend project anymore. It was a full restoration. After getting several estimates, I hired a local restoration company with experience repairing historic homes. Their foreman, Jack Reynolds, had spent nearly 30 years working on old farmhouses throughout the Hudson Valley. During our first walkthrough, he ran his hand across one of the basement walls. "They don't build them like this anymore," he said. "Solid fieldstone." He smiled. "If this house has survived this long, it's worth saving." I liked him immediately. Work began the following Monday. For the first few days, everything was routine. Replacing damaged beams, removing sections of rotted flooring, repairing broken pipes. Each evening Jack called with a progress update. Nothing unusual. Until Thursday. My phone rang a little after 5. Jack sounded different. "Emily, you might want to come out here." "Is something wrong?" "I don't know. But we found something that doesn't make much sense." 45 minutes later, I pulled into the driveway. Most of the crew had already gone home. Jack was waiting beside the basement door. "I didn't want anyone touching it until you saw it." He led me downstairs. Part of the north wall had been opened to replace damaged support beams. As my flashlight swept across the exposed stonework, something immediately caught my eye. The wall changed halfway across. The original stones were rough, uneven, and dark with age. The section near the corner looked different. The mortar was newer. The stones were cut more evenly. It wasn't obvious unless you were looking for it. Jack pointed to the difference. "See that?" I nodded. "It doesn't match." "Exactly. The original foundation is over 100 years old. This section isn't." He tapped the newer stones gently with the handle of his flashlight. The sound echoed differently. Hollow. My pulse quickened. "You think there's something behind it?" He shrugged. "Only one way to find out." Before removing anything, Jack pulled out his phone. "I've already documented the wall for the insurance company. Old houses can surprise you. We don't want anyone wondering later what we changed." That made sense. He carefully removed several loose stones. A narrow opening appeared. Cool air drifted out from inside. Jack shined his flashlight through the gap. "I'll be." He stepped aside. "You should see this." Hidden behind the false wall was a narrow chamber no larger than a closet. Dust covered everything. The space had clearly been sealed for years. Sitting in the center was an old iron chest. It wasn't ornate. It wasn't polished. It looked like the kind of heavy lockbox someone cared more about protecting than displaying. We didn't touch it. Not yet. Jack slowly circled the chamber with his flashlight. No wiring. No pipes. No structural reason for this space. He looked back at me. Somebody built this on purpose. I stepped closer. The chest was coated in decades of dust, but one part of the lid stood out where my flashlight caught the light. 2 letters had been carved into the metal. EC. My initials. A chill ran through me. Jack frowned. "Does that mean anything to you?" I couldn't answer, because it meant too much. My name was Emily Carter. So had Grandma's. But somehow, I didn't think those letters were meant for her. Jack reached toward the handle before stopping himself. "You want to open it?" I stared at the chest for several long seconds. Then I slowly shook my head. No, not until we document everything. If Grandpa had gone to the trouble of hiding this room, there had to be a reason. And after everything that had happened since the reading of his will, I wasn't willing to take chances. Standing in that quiet basement, I had the unmistakable feeling that the old farmhouse had been keeping one final promise. The question was no longer whether Grandpa had left me something. The question was, why had he gone to so much trouble to make sure no one else found it first? Jack and I didn't open the chest that night. The discovery was too unusual, too deliberate. If Grandpa had gone to the trouble of hiding an entire chamber behind a false wall, the last thing I wanted to do was rush in and accidentally destroy something important. Jack took photographs from every angle before carefully lifting the chest out of the hidden space. It was heavier than either of us expected. We carried it into the workshop and set it on Grandpa's old workbench. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Finally, Jack broke the silence. "You ever know your grandfather to build secret rooms?" I shook my head. "Never. He always struck me as the kind of man who kept things simple." So did I. The lock had rusted shut years earlier. It took nearly 20 minutes of careful work before Jack managed to free the latch without damaging it. The old hinges groaned as the lid slowly opened. Neither of us knew what we expected to find. Gold, cash, jewelry. Instead, the chest was filled with neatly wrapped document folders protected by waxed cloth. There were handwritten journals, property deeds, old bank statements, family photographs, several sealed envelopes. Nothing inside looked random. Everything had been organized with extraordinary care. Jack let out a quiet breath. Whoever packed this wanted these papers to survive. I reached for the top envelope. Across the front, in Grandpa's familiar handwriting, were 3 simple words. For Emily. I carefully unfolded the letter. "Emily, if you're reading this, you chose to keep the farmhouse. That tells me something money never could. It tells me you were willing to look beyond appearances." I stopped reading for a moment. Jack quietly stepped outside, giving me the room. The letter continued. "There may come a day when people ask you to make quick decisions. Don't. Questions deserve patience. So does the truth." There were no dramatic accusations. No names. No shocking confessions. Just Grandpa's familiar voice reminding me not to jump to conclusions. Near the bottom of the page, one sentence had been underlined. "Never mistake suspicion for proof." I folded the letter carefully and continued sorting through the remaining documents. Most of them appeared ordinary. Tax records, insurance policies, maintenance receipts. But one folder immediately caught my attention. It contained monthly bank statements from one investment account. At first glance, everything looked normal. Then I noticed something strange. According to the probate documents I had received after Grandpa's funeral, that account contained just under $890,000. Yet one original statement inside the chest, dated only 6 months earlier, showed a balance of almost $1.9 million. I checked the account number. It matched. The bank matched. The statement format matched. Only the balance was different. Almost $1 million had disappeared. I searched through Grandpa's journals, expecting to find an explanation. There wasn't one. If he'd transferred that kind of money, he would have recorded it. He recorded everything. The absence of an explanation bothered me more than the numbers themselves. The next morning, I called an estate attorney recommended by one of my coworkers. Laura Bennett agreed to meet that afternoon. Her office overlooked the Hudson River, and every shelf seemed packed with legal books that had actually been read instead of displayed. She spent nearly an hour reviewing the documents without saying much. Occasionally, she circled a date, made a note, compared signatures. Finally, she closed the folder. I can't tell you a crime occurred. Not from these documents alone. She placed 2 bank statements side by side. But I can tell you these records deserve a closer look. The balances don't match the probate filings. So what do we do? I asked. We verify. She explained that the first step was obtaining complete records directly from the bank. After that, she wanted an independent forensic document examiner to review several signatures from Grandpa's final year. If someone made changes, she said, the evidence has to speak for itself. I appreciated that answer. She wasn't building a case. She was looking for the truth. Before I left, she gave me one final piece of advice. For now, tell as few people as possible. If someone altered financial records, they won't appreciate learning that you've started asking questions. Her words stayed with me the entire drive back to the farmhouse. As I turned onto Willow Creek Road, something immediately felt wrong. The front door stood slightly open. I was certain I'd locked it. Jack was already outside waiting for me. I called the sheriff's office. What happened? I'm not sure. When the crew arrived this morning, the basement door was already open. A county deputy had already inspected the property by the time I arrived. Fortunately, nothing appeared to be missing. Grandpa's tools were still in the workshop. The furniture hadn't been disturbed. Even the old radio remained on the same shelf. But the basement told a different story. Fresh boot prints covered the dusty floor. Every one of them led directly toward the hidden chamber. Not toward the living room. Not toward the bedrooms. Straight to the wall. Unfortunately, dozens of contractors had already walked through the area before anyone realized someone had broken in. Any fingerprints had long since been contaminated. The deputy shook his head. Whoever came here knew exactly where they were going. Jack looked at me after the deputy walked upstairs. I never told anyone about that wall. I didn't either. Neither of us finished the thought. We didn't have to. Someone else had already known. That evening, Laura locked every original document inside a secure evidence vault at her office. Not because we knew a crime had occurred, because we weren't willing to risk losing the only original records we had. As I prepared to leave, Laura handed me one last document. I requested the county property history. I glanced down. Most of it looked routine, until I reached the final page. Someone had contacted the county asking about purchasing the farmhouse. The inquiry had been submitted through a limited liability company. No owner's name. No business history. Just an LLC. What date was this? I asked. Laura looked directly at me. 2 days after your grandfather's funeral. But nearly 3 weeks before anyone knew you'd inherited the property. Driving home that night, I couldn't stop replaying the day's events. The missing money. The anonymous company. The break-in. Individually, each one might have meant nothing. Together, they no longer felt like coincidences. For the first time since Grandpa died, I realized I wasn't the only person searching for answers. The difference was, whoever had started before me was beginning to run out of time. For the next few days, life settled into an uneasy routine. Jack's crew continued repairing the farmhouse. Laura waited for the bank to respond to her requests. And I went back to work, trying to convince myself that finding the hidden chamber hadn't changed everything. It had. I simply hadn't realized how much. The first sign came the following Wednesday. As I left my office that evening, I noticed a gray SUV parked across the street. Nothing unusual about that. Until I saw the same vehicle again the next morning. And again on Friday. The driver never got out. Never approached me. Never did anything that would justify calling the police. Still, every time I glanced in that direction, the SUV was there. When I finally crossed the street after work on Friday, it pulled away before I could get close enough to read the license plate. Maybe it was a coincidence. Maybe it wasn't. I decided not to tell anyone. Not yet. That evening, my father called. His voice sounded warmer than it had in months. Emily, your mother wants everyone over for dinner on Sunday. I frowned. We're getting together just because? He laughed softly. Does there always have to be a reason? With my family. Usually, yes. I'll be there. The conversation lasted less than a minute. After hanging up, I couldn't shake the feeling that the invitation had come at a very convenient time. Sunday evening looked exactly like every family dinner I could remember. The same dining room. The same polished oak table. The same crystal glasses. Only the mood felt different. Everyone seemed unusually interested in me. Daniel started before we had even finished the salad. So, how's Grandpa's old place? It's coming along. You actually hired contractors? I did. He smiled. That's got to be expensive. It is. Natalie looked up from her plate. You still planning to keep it? For now. She exchanged a quick glance with Dad. I would have sold it. Dad set down his fork. I've had developers asking about that property for years. They're probably still interested. I'm sure they are. So why not hear them out? I took a sip of water before answering. Because I haven't decided what I want to do. No one argued. But the conversation ended much faster than it normally would have. It wasn't disappointment I noticed. It was calculation. Everyone seemed to be measuring every word I said, trying to decide whether I knew. Something they didn't. After dinner, I stepped outside onto the back patio for some fresh air. The spring evening was cool and quiet. A few moments later, Daniel joined me. He leaned against the porch railing without saying anything. Finally, he broke the silence. You know Dad isn't a bad guy. The comment caught me off guard. I never said he was. He just, Daniel searched for the right words. Gets tunnel vision sometimes. What does that mean? He shrugged. When he thinks he's protecting the family, he convinces himself the ends justify the means. That wasn't an answer. It was almost an apology. Before I could ask another question, Daniel looked directly at me. If you found something at the farmhouse, don't assume you understand it yet. My heartbeat quickened. What makes you think I found anything? A faint smile crossed his face. I don't. I'm just saying. Grandpa had a habit of leaving people puzzles instead of explanations. Then he pushed himself away from the railing. Just be careful. He walked back inside before I could stop him. I watched him through the kitchen window. He looked different. Not frightened. Burdened. As though he'd been carrying something for a very long time. The next morning, Laura called. I finally heard back from the bank. I closed my office door. What did they say? They confirmed that the account numbers on your original statements are authentic. So Grandpa's records are real? As far as the bank can tell, yes. They're now gathering archived transaction records. It wasn't the breakthrough we'd hoped for, but it was enough to keep moving forward. Then Laura added something unexpected. I found another interesting detail. What is it? I've been reading your grandfather's journals again. The same name appears twice. What name? Samuel Brooks. The words instantly sounded familiar. I drove straight to Laura's office after work. Together, we searched through the remaining papers from the iron chest. Nearly an hour passed before I found what I was looking for. A faded photograph tucked inside one of Grandpa's journals. Two men stood in front of the farmhouse. One was Grandpa. The other was someone I didn't recognize. On the back, Grandpa had written only 6 words. If anything happens, find Samuel Brooks. Laura turned the photograph over several times. No address. No explanation. Nothing. Can you find him? She nodded. I'll try. If your grandfather left you a name instead of an answer, there's probably a reason. Late that afternoon, I drove to the farmhouse to check on the renovation. Jack was waiting near the mailbox. His expression immediately told me something was wrong. He pointed toward the muddy edge of the property. Fresh tire tracks cut across the grass behind the barn. They weren't here this morning, he said. You saw who made them? He nodded. Not clearly. A pickup truck pulled onto the property. It never came to the house. It just sat back there for about 20 minutes. What happened then? My crew finished early and started walking toward the barn. The truck left before anyone got close. I followed the tracks with my eyes. They ended near a line of trees overlooking the farmhouse. From there, whoever had been parked there could see almost the entire property. The porch, the workshop, even the basement entrance. They weren't lost, Jack said quietly. No, I already knew he was right. Lost people don't sit silently on someone else's land. They don't leave the moment they're noticed. Someone had come to watch. Not the house. Me. As the sun disappeared behind the trees, one thought refused to leave my mind. The break-in hadn't been the end of someone's search. It had only been the beginning. And whoever wanted whatever Grandpa had hidden now knew they weren't the only one looking. Laura called just after 9 the following Monday. I found him. I didn't need to ask who she meant. Samuel Brooks? Yes. She sounded almost surprised herself. He lives in a small town about 40 miles north of the farmhouse. Retired CPA. 83 years old. No criminal record. No obvious connection to your family. I didn't hesitate. When can we see him? This afternoon. By lunchtime, we were driving north along the Hudson River. Neither of us spoke much. The closer we got, the more I wondered what Grandpa had expected me to find. A witness? An old friend? Or someone who knew the answers Grandpa never had the chance to explain? Samuel lived in a modest white cottage overlooking a quiet lake. The yard was neat. A small fishing boat rested beside the dock. Nothing about the place suggested mystery. It felt like the home of a man who had spent years enjoying a peaceful retirement. When he opened the front door, he studied my face for several long seconds. Then he smiled. "You have John's eyes. No one had ever said that to me before. You knew my grandfather? For nearly 50 years. He stepped aside. I've been hoping I'd never meet you." That wasn't the answer I expected. He noticed the confusion on my face and gave a tired smile. "If you're standing on my porch." Something went terribly wrong. Inside, the house was warm and simple. Books lined one wall. Family photographs covered another. Grandpa appeared in several of them. Fishing, volunteering at charity events, standing beside Samuel in front of a much younger farmhouse. The pictures showed a side of Grandpa I had rarely seen. Relaxed, almost carefree. Samuel poured coffee before anyone mentioned the reason for our visit. Finally, I removed Grandpa's note from my bag and placed it on the table. He read it slowly. When he finished, he folded it with remarkable care. "I wondered if he'd leave you that. You knew about the letter?" "No, I just knew John. He always believed people deserved facts, not assumptions." Laura introduced herself and briefly explained what we had found inside the hidden chamber. Samuel listened without interrupting. When she finished, he walked to an old desk in the corner of the room. For a moment, I expected him to return carrying another box full of hidden documents. Instead, he brought back a thin leather folder. "This is all I have." Inside were photocopies of engagement letters from a forensic accounting firm, invoices, appointment confirmations, meeting notes. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that proved a crime. Laura looked up. "Your grandfather hired forensic accountants?" Samuel nodded. "About 4 years before he died." "Why?" He noticed. Several financial transactions he couldn't explain. He wanted professionals to review the books. I leaned forward. "Did they find anything?" Samuel sighed. "I never saw their final report. John stopped the review before it was completed." "Why would he do that?" Samuel stared quietly into his coffee. "Because the questions were leading toward his own family." The room fell silent. "He told me something I'll never forget." Samuel's voice softened. "If they're innocent, I don't want suspicion destroying them. If they're guilty." He paused. "I need more than suspicion before I accuse my own son." That sounded exactly like Grandpa. Patient, careful, determined to separate truth from emotion. Samuel slid one document across the table. It was the original engagement agreement with the accounting firm. Laura studied it closely. "This helps." "How?" "It establishes a timeline." She tapped the date. "It proves your grandfather had concerns years before he passed away. This wasn't something created after his death. It shows his questions began while he was still handling his own finances." For the first time, we had evidence that Grandpa himself had questioned what was happening. Not proof of fraud, but proof that he had started asking questions long before anyone else. As we prepared to leave, Samuel stopped me. "Emily." I turned back. "Your grandfather changed during that last year." "In what way?" "He became more careful. He stopped discussing financial matters over the phone. He kept fewer papers at the farmhouse. And shortly before he died, he mentioned building a place no one would think to search. The hidden chamber." Samuel nodded. "I assume that's where you found everything." "It was." He smiled sadly. I suppose he was right. Halfway back to town, Laura's phone rang. She answered using the car's speaker system. It was the forensic document examiner. "I've completed the preliminary handwriting comparison." Laura glanced toward me. "What did you find?" "I can't issue my final opinion yet. I need a few additional samples. But the question signature contains several inconsistencies." "What kind of inconsistencies?" "The pen. Pressure changes unnaturally. The letter spacing doesn't match. And the writing rhythm is inconsistent with John's known signatures." Laura thanked him before ending the call. Neither of us spoke for nearly a mile. Finally, she broke the silence. "It's moving in the direction we expected. But we're still not there." She was right. Suspicion wasn't enough. Grandpa had believed that. So did we. As we turned onto Willow Creek Road, Jack was already waiting outside the farmhouse. His expression immediately caught my attention. I called the deputy again. What happened? He pointed behind the barn. Fresh tire tracks cut through the damp ground. There were 2 vehicles this time. They left before we could get close. The responding deputy examined the tracks carefully. His flashlight moved slowly across the impressions left in the mud. We'll photograph everything, he said. But with all the construction traffic, there's a good chance we won't get anything useful. Rain earlier that morning had already begun softening the edges of the tire impressions. By sunset, most of the details would probably disappear. It wasn't much. Just another unanswered question. But it fit the pattern. Someone had entered the farmhouse. Someone had watched the property. Now someone had come back again. That evening, Laura moved every original document into a professionally monitored evidence vault used by her law firm. No copies. No originals remained at the farmhouse. She closed the heavy steel door and looked at me. If someone is still searching, they're already too late. Driving home that night, Grandpa's words echoed in my mind. Never mistake suspicion for proof. For weeks, I thought I was uncovering a mystery. Now I understood something far more unsettling. Whoever had been rewriting the truth for years was beginning to realize the evidence still existed. And desperate people eventually make mistakes. Real investigations don't move at the speed of television. Nothing happened overnight. Days turned into weeks. Weeks became months. While the farmhouse slowly came back to life, the investigation did the same. Jack's crew finished repairing the foundation before moving on to the roof. Fresh paint replaced weathered boards. The front porch stood straight again. For the first time in years, the house looked lived in instead of forgotten. Meanwhile, Laura kept building the case one document at a time. The bank eventually produced years of archived records. County officials released copies of probate filings. The forensic document examiner requested additional samples of Grandpa's handwriting from old tax returns, personal letters, and business contracts. Every answer uncovered another question. Nearly 8 months after the hidden chamber was discovered, Laura called. I need you downtown tomorrow morning. What's happening? The Financial Crimes Unit wants to interview you. The conference room at the district attorney's office was smaller than I expected. There were no dramatic speeches. No detectives trying to intimidate anyone. Just 2 investigators, a recorder, and a stack of folders. For nearly 3 hours, they asked careful, methodical questions. When had Grandpa first seemed concerned about his finances? Who knew about the farmhouse? Who discovered the hidden chamber? Who had access to the property after his death? What exactly had happened during the break-in? Did anyone encourage me to sell the farmhouse? I answered everything as honestly as I could. Near the end of the interview, one investigator flipped through his notes. We've also identified the company that inquired about purchasing the property. I immediately sat up. The LLC? He nodded. It wasn't an active development company. It existed primarily to purchase land. But financial records show it was funded through one of several shell companies we're already examining. Does that mean they were behind the break-ins? We can't say that. Not with the evidence we have. But it explains why someone showed interest in your grandfather's property before the will was even read. One question had finally been answered. Not completely, but enough to make the bigger picture a little clearer. Before we left, the second investigator mentioned something else. We also looked into the gray SUV you reported. My heart skipped. We located the driver. It belonged to a licensed private investigator, hired by the same LLC. What was he doing? He claims he was gathering information about the property before making a purchase offer. Did he break into the farmhouse? The investigator shook his head. We found no evidence connecting him to the break-ins. So for now, those remain separate incidents. It wasn't the dramatic revelation I'd imagined, but it closed another question that had been bothering me for months. When Laura and I reached the parking lot, she smiled. That's how real investigations work, one loose end at a time. A few weeks later, the handwriting examiner delivered his final report. Laura invited me to her office before opening the envelope. She read the report silently. Then she slid it across the desk. The conclusion was clear. The question's signature on the power of attorney was highly inconsistent with Grandpa's authenticated handwriting. The report listed dozens of differences. Letter formation, pen pressure, writing rhythm, natural variation. None of them proved who had written the signature. But together, they strongly supported the conclusion that Grandpa hadn't. That report changed everything. The investigation expanded. Subpoenas were issued. Banks released additional financial records. Several companies connected to the missing money existed only on paper. Some shared mailing addresses. Others had no employees. Others had never conducted any legitimate business at all. The pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. Then, one rainy Tuesday afternoon, Daniel called. His voice sounded different. Not defensive, not confident, just tired. Can we meet? We chose a small coffee shop halfway between our homes. For several minutes, he stared at his untouched coffee. Finally, he spoke. I owe you the truth. I waited. I knew Dad was moving money between companies. He swallowed hard. He told me it was for taxes. I believed him. Were you involved? No. I stayed out of it. That's the problem. He rubbed his forehead. I stopped asking questions because it was easier. The words hung heavily between us. Grandpa tried to warn me, he continued. He kept telling me that shortcuts have a way of becoming habits. I thought he was talking about business. He wasn't. For the first time since Grandpa died, I wasn't looking at the older brother who had always seemed to have everything figured out. I was looking at someone who had finally realized how much he'd ignored. I've already spoken with my attorney, Daniel said quietly. I'm meeting with investigators next week. You don't have to do that. I know. I'm doing it anyway. A month later, he kept his word. Investigators never told me exactly what he shared. They couldn't. But Laura later confirmed that Daniel's cooperation helped establish the timeline investigators had been trying to verify for months. His testimony didn't solve the case. It helped connect the pieces that already existed. Almost a year after Grandpa's funeral, the district attorney's office announced that formal criminal charges had been filed. The case alleged financial fraud, falsified records, and the use of forged legal documents during the administration of Grandpa's estate. It wasn't the end. It was the beginning of a criminal trial that would take many more months to resolve. The following evening, there was another knock at my door. This time it was my mother. She looked exhausted. Not because of the cameras outside my parents' house. Because she'd spent months carrying something she could no longer ignore. For a long time, neither of us spoke. Finally, she broke the silence. I knew your father wasn't telling me everything. I didn't interrupt. I kept believing he'd fix it. Every time I asked, he'd tell me to give him another month. She shook her head slowly. I told myself I was protecting the family. Her voice cracked. But I wasn't protecting anyone. She looked at me with tears in her eyes. I was protecting my own comfort. There was no excuse in her voice. No request for forgiveness. Just honesty. It was the first truly honest conversation we'd shared in years. After she left, I drove to the farmhouse. The sun was setting behind the hills. The porch lights glowed against the evening sky. As I stood there listening to the wind move through the trees, I remembered something Grandpa used to tell me whenever a storm rolled across the valley. The truth doesn't stop being true just because people are afraid of it. For months, I'd been searching for answers. Now the answers were beginning to stand on their own. And once the truth finally has evidence behind it, it doesn't need anyone to speak louder. The civil trial concluded nearly 18 months after Grandpa's funeral. By then, the courthouse had become strangely familiar. The security officers recognized the attorneys. The clerks knew most of the witnesses by name. Even the long waits in crowded hallways had started to feel routine. If I'd learned one thing through the entire process, it was this. Real justice moves slowly. Painfully slowly. The final hearing lasted less than 2 hours. It was almost disappointing after everything that had led up to it. Months of financial records. Dozens of witness interviews. Expert testimony from accountants, handwriting specialists, and estate professionals. All of it condensed into a single morning. The judge reviewed the findings carefully before delivering the court's decision. The questioned power of attorney was ruled unreliable and could no longer be used to justify the transfers that had taken place under its authority. Several transactions completed during the administration of Grandpa's estate were ordered back into review. The probate process would be partially reopened. It wasn't a dramatic victory. No one applauded. No one celebrated. It was simply the court acknowledging that Grandpa's estate deserved to be handled honestly. The separate criminal case would continue on its own timeline. That chapter belonged to another courtroom. As Laura and I walked down the courthouse steps, reporters gathered near the entrance. She answered a few procedural questions. I kept walking. There wasn't anything I wanted to say into a microphone. The evidence had already spoken for itself. A week later, Daniel called. His voice sounded steadier than it had in months. Could you meet me at the farmhouse? When I arrived, his pickup truck was parked beside the barn. He was standing near Grandpa's workshop holding a worn cardboard box. I found these while cleaning out Dad's office. Inside were appointment books, old calendars, canceled checks, a handful of notebooks filled with handwritten reminders. Nothing inside looked particularly important on its own, but investigators had already explained that small pieces often mattered the most. Dates, phone numbers, meeting schedules. Sometimes they connected gaps no one else had noticed. I already gave copies to the investigators, Daniel said. These belong with Grandpa's papers. I nodded. Thank you. He looked around the workshop for a long moment. I keep thinking about something Grandpa used to say. What was that? Character is what survives after success disappears. A faint smile crossed my face. That sounds like him. Daniel gave a quiet laugh. I never understood what he meant. I think I do now. Before leaving, he paused beside the old workbench. I'm not asking you to trust me again. I know that takes time. I just want to spend whatever years I have left earning it. This time I believed him, not because of his words, because of everything he'd done during the previous year. He had met with investigators every time they asked, turned over records without hesitation, accepted responsibility for the things he should have questioned sooner. Trust wasn't rebuilt through apologies. It was rebuilt through consistency. Several months later, the county completed an updated survey of Grandpa's property. Laura invited me to review the report with her. She spread the new survey across her conference table. The farmhouse itself was never the valuable part. She traced a line across the map. The land is. Nearly 200 acres surrounded the house. Fields. Woodland. A small creek that crossed the eastern edge of the property. Over the past decade, nearby communities had slowly expanded. A new state highway had improved access to the area. Land values had steadily increased. Developers had been trying to assemble large parcels for years. Grandpa had refused every offer. Not because he expected the land to become more valuable, because he wanted it to remain a home. For the first time, I understood why someone had tried to buy the property before the will was even read. The old farmhouse had never been the prize. It had simply been sitting on it. By early autumn, Jack and his crew finished the restoration. The front porch looked exactly as I remembered from childhood. Fresh white paint covered the railings. The workshop smelled of clean lumber instead of damp wood. The barn stood straighter than it had in decades. On the final afternoon, Jack handed me a small envelope. Inside was a photograph his crew had taken on the day they discovered the hidden chamber. The wall was still intact. The iron chest sat exactly where Grandpa had hidden it. Thought you might want this, Jack said. I do, more than he probably realized. A few weeks later, Samuel Brooks stopped by for one last visit before winter. We sat on the porch as the sun dipped below the trees. He looked across the fields for a long time before speaking. You know, John never talked about leaving money behind. He talked about leaving people prepared. Prepared. That word stayed with me. Prepared to tell the truth. Prepared to ask difficult questions. Prepared to do the right thing, even when it meant standing alone. Before leaving, Samuel rested a hand on my shoulder. I'm glad the farmhouse found its way home. I smiled. I think it always knew where home was. Late that November, Mom called and asked if we could meet. We sat together in a small park overlooking the river. The trees had almost lost all their leaves. For several minutes, neither of us said anything. Finally, she spoke. I used to think keeping the peace was the same thing as protecting the family. She looked down at her hands. I know now that they're not the same. I didn't argue. She wasn't asking me to. Before we stood to leave, she handed me a small cloth case. Inside were Grandpa's reading glasses. I found these in a drawer. I thought they belonged with you. On the drive back to the farmhouse, I placed the glasses beside Grandpa's pocket watch. Two ordinary objects, worth almost nothing. Yet somehow, they felt more valuable than anything listed in the estate. Because neither one represented what Grandpa owned. They represented who he was. Standing on the porch that evening, watching the last light disappear across the fields, I finally understood something that had taken me nearly 2 years to learn. Grandpa hadn't spent his final years trying to protect his wealth. He'd been trying to protect the truth. Everything else was simply the path that eventually led me to it. Nearly 2 years have passed since the day I unlocked the front door of Grandpa's farmhouse with a key that barely fit the old lock. Sometimes it feels like a lifetime. Other days, it feels as though I can still hear his boots crossing the porch before sunrise. The farmhouse doesn't feel forgotten anymore. The porch has been rebuilt. The roof no longer leaks during spring storms. Fresh white curtains hang in the kitchen windows. Every summer, wildflowers return along the fence Grandpa and I repaired together when I was a little girl. The place is alive again. Not because the house changed, because the people inside it finally did. The criminal case reached its conclusion several months after the civil proceedings ended. Like everything else in the legal system, it took time. Far more time than anyone expected. The outcome mattered. But by then, it no longer defined my life. I'd spent nearly 2 years looking backward. It was finally time to start looking ahead. Daniel kept every promise he made. He continued cooperating with investigators whenever they needed him. He accepted responsibility for the questions he should have asked years earlier. He even left the investment firm where he'd built his career. These days, he works with a nonprofit that teaches older adults how to recognize financial scams and protect themselves from fraud. The salary is smaller. The work matters more. Every now and then, he'll stop by the farmhouse carrying coffee and donuts on a Saturday morning. Sometimes we work on the barn. Sometimes we fish in the creek. Sometimes we simply sit on the porch without saying much at all. We don't pretend the past never happened. We simply refuse to let it decide every conversation. That has been enough. Mom visits once or twice a month. She usually brings fresh flowers for Grandma's grave before stopping by the house. The first few visits were awkward. Neither of us knew how to talk to each other anymore. Eventually, we stopped trying to find perfect words. Instead, we cooked dinner, pulled weeds in the garden, painted an old fence together. Healing, I discovered, often sounds remarkably ordinary. One afternoon, while we were shelling peas on the back porch, she smiled to herself. "What?" I asked. "I was just thinking. Your grandfather would have loved seeing this place again." "So would I." She nodded. "I think he does." She never apologized again. She didn't need to. Showing up month after month said more than another conversation ever could. Samuel Brooks still insists he's retired. I don't believe him. Every few weeks, he finds another excuse to visit. Sometimes he brings old photographs of Grandpa I'd never seen before. Sometimes he claims the bass in the pond are getting lazy and needs someone to remind them how to bite. Mostly, I think he just enjoys seeing the farmhouse filled with laughter again. Before leaving one afternoon, he paused beside Grandpa's workshop. "You know what I told you the first day we met?" I smiled. "You have John's eyes." Samuel nodded. "I wasn't talking about how you look." I laughed softly. "I figured that out. You see people the way he did. You keep looking until you find the truth." For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he rested a hand on my shoulder. John picked the right granddaughter. Watching him drive away, I realized how much those words meant. Not because they praised me, because they closed a conversation Grandpa had started long before either of us knew it. Last autumn, I turned Grandpa's workshop into something the whole community could use. Nothing elaborate. Just a warm room with long wooden tables, fresh coffee, and shelves filled with information about estate planning, financial literacy, and protecting older adults from financial exploitation. Once a month, volunteer attorneys, accountants, and social workers donate their time there. No one pays a fee. No one is turned away. It feels like the kind of place Grandpa would have quietly supported without ever putting his name on the building. The old iron chest still sits on a shelf near the back wall. Empty. People often ask why I keep it. Wouldn't it be easier to throw it away after everything it brought into my life? Maybe. But that chest never created the truth. It simply protected it until someone was ready to uncover it. Some things deserve to be remembered, not because they brought happiness, because they changed us. A few evenings ago, I locked the workshop after everyone had gone home. The sun had already slipped behind the hills. Golden lights stretched across the fields. As I reached the porch, I caught my reflection in the front window. For just a second, I remembered what Samuel had said the day we first met. "You have John's eyes." Maybe he never meant my face. Maybe he meant I'd finally learned to see what Grandpa had seen all along. That families aren't held together by silence. They're held together by honesty. I reached into my jacket pocket and took out Grandpa's old pocket watch. It still doesn't run. I've never had it repaired. Some things aren't meant to measure time. They're meant to remind us how we spend it. I slipped the watch back into my pocket, switched off the porch light, and locked the front door. The farmhouse disappeared quietly into the evening shadows. 2 years earlier, those walls had been hiding secrets. Tonight, they were simply holding memories. And somehow, I think Grandpa would have liked that. Thank you for spending this journey with me. If this story stayed with you, I'd love to know where you're watching from and which moment you'll remember the longest. Until next time, take good care of the people who choose honesty, even when it's difficult. They're often the reason a house becomes a home.